You can say that provider provides widgets with a non-widget object. But what if one provider needs a value from another provider? For example, if there is an app that needs to increment the counter according to the color of the background, the code that handles the counter needs to know what the current color is. It is a proxy provider that makes this possible in cases like these. According to the provider's official documentation, proxy provider is described as a provider that builds a value based on other providers. However, just as there are several types of providers, such as a provider and change and notify provider, proxy provider also has a proxy provider and change and notify proxy provider. I will briefly talk about the definition of proxy provider now, but you probably won't get it right away. When you see it being used in practice, you will be able to understand it better. And since there is a proxy provider and change and notify proxy provider, we'll learn when to use a proxy provider, when to use a change and notify proxy provider, and what is the best practice for using it. Proxy provider is a provider that creates a value depending on the values of other providers. So let's first see what it looks like. If you look at the constructor, unlike a provider, create is optional and update is required. And unlike create, update can be called multiple times. But when you think about it, this is obvious. Since proxy provider depends on the values of other providers, so if the values of other providers change, you have to create a new one. So create can be called only once and update can be called multiple times. And the reason create is optional here is that if there is an object it needs to handle itself, it needs to be created. But if the role of the proxy provider is to create only computed values, there is no need to use create. This figure is the configuration diagram of the to-do app you will create later. For example, let's say you have 1000 to-do items. Among them, when we want to know only the number of active items, that is, the number of items that are not completed, in this case, it's convenient to use a proxy provider. In this case, if we call the provider that calculates the number of active items active to the count does not need create, right? Because active to the count does not need an object to create and manage by itself. But the active to count will change each time the user clicks to toggle the to-do item. So active to the count should be newly executed whenever the value that affects the active to the count changes. The thing to remember now is that you should use a proxy provider if one provider depends on the value of another provider. But a create callback or proxy provider is optional and update callback is required. The reason is that there are cases where a proxy provider creates a new value by relying just on the value of another provider. If there is a separate object to be handled, and some or all of the object value depends on other providers, in this case, you need to create an object to handle yourself through create callback. And whenever the value of the dependent provider changes, you have to handle it through update callback. And I said that updates is called more than once. To be precise, it is called in the following cases. The first is when proxy provider obtains the value of the provider it depends on for the first time. The second is whenever the value of the provider that the proxy provider depends on changes. And the third is whenever the proxy provider is rebuilt. Additionally, one of the notable uses of proxy provider is that although this content is in the document, it is not comprehensively organized. So I'll organize it here. Even when the provider depends on a changing value, you can use a proxy provider. This is because every time the value changes, you have to create a new value. In the next chapter, we'll learn in more detail about the proxy provider.